You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
This is Jed Kolko. I'm the chief economist at Indeed, based in San Francisco.
And Chrissy Mancini-Nichols, also in San Francisco.
Awesome. I think we're all in San Francisco. That's awesome. Too bad we couldn't get together and have this in person. We're almost there. We're almost there.
Next time.
Yeah, I get my second vaccination on Thursday. So in June, I think we'll be able to get together at some point, hopefully. Are you all taken care of in terms of your vaccinations?
I am.
Nice.
I am. Was very happy for being just barely 50 plus this time around. So.
That's a good thing and a bad thing, I think. Like people are like, oh man, I'm over 50. And then they're like, yes, I get the vaccine faster.
Yeah, every once in a while there's an advantage.
How has the pandemic been treating you generally, Jed?
I've been pretty fortunate, healthy and employed, missing lots of people and eager to travel. But, otherwise, I've been lucky in that it's been pretty manageable. I've been in San Francisco the whole time. I live in the Mission, and, it has been, there have been people on the street the whole time. So I think in that sense, it probably felt less isolated than lots of other places people spent the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm here in Noe Valley and people, and I walk down to Valencia and all that all the time. And it's just super, super busy, especially this last week. I guess driving somewhere on Saturday with my sister, we just passed by Dolores Park and it was bonkers. And then I saw pictures of Valencia being just insane. People were gathering closer than I've seen at a rock concert back in the day. So I think people are getting back into the swing of things a little bit. Chrissy, anything exciting happening on your end?
No, I was just thinking, I live by Chrissy Field and it's always bonkers over here. So, but I have noticed a big uptick in the past maybe week or two. So slowly but surely, maybe we'll be returning to some more normal times.
I hope so. Well, this is episode 89, Shut-ins Anonymous 101 is in session. Before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. And thanks to everybody who subscribes through podcatchers. So let's just dive in here. Here are a few of the stories that piqued our interest from the last few weeks. I saw these pieces on when I was gathering news for the newsletter. And so I wanted to have Jed on because there were a couple of topics that Jed, you've been writing about and tweeting about that I thought would be good to have a whole discussion about. So first, my first memory of actually reading some of your work, Jed, was when you were working at PPIC, looking at the importance of employment clusters and transit expansion. And then you were at Trulia, and now you're the chief economist at Indeed. For a little bit of background for the listeners, what's your role there, and what kind of stuff are you exploring?
So at Indeed, I'm our chief economist, and we have a research team that's global. We do research in 6 countries, looking at what's happening in the labor market. Because we have most job postings on our site and see lots of kinds of search activity on our site, we're often able to see what's going on both in terms of labor demand and labor supply, sometimes at a more granular level than what we see in official government data, and sometimes faster. And during the pandemic, we've been able to track what's happening almost in real time with job postings to get some sense of which employers have started hiring, where are they, what sectors, maybe 5 or 6 weeks ahead of what we're able to get out of government data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, and then you take all of that and then you write pieces for different, you've written a couple of pieces this last couple of weeks for the New York Times. And the first one I think I wanted to talk about was the discussion about U.S. migration and even the technology hubs about, for better or worse, name superstar cities, and the related discussion about congressional reapportionment that comes with these population changes. So Perhaps we can start a little bit with migration more generally. Before and during the pandemic, a lot of ink was spilled over the emptying of cities, but that doesn't seem to quite be the case.
Well, there have been some movements, and we're now at the point where we've had a few different data sources all saying the same things, even though they come from completely different raw ingredients, which starts to give us some confidence that some trends are becoming more clear. It does look like some neighborhoods in some big densities have lost people who have moved elsewhere, especially expensive neighborhoods, very dense cities, parts of San Francisco, parts of New York, parts of a few other cities. And this has been pretty consistent, whether you look at change of address data or even some of the census data, the population estimates that just came out. For the most part, this is a continuation of pre-pandemic trends. A little bit more extreme in some cases. There were some vacation towns and resort areas that drew in more people during the pandemic than they had in previous years. It's also too soon to say whether these are permanent shifts or some of this is temporary. And underlying all this, of course, is lots of things that happened during the pandemic or made the pandemic look different might not necessarily be long-term changes in behavior. It might be that the pandemic caused people to delay decisions that they're going to make later on or pull forward decisions that they were thinking about for the future. For instance, there was lots of home improvement that went on during the pandemic. It is unclear whether all that work is incremental to what would have happened otherwise, or it's just pulling forward 2 or 3 years of home improvements that people ended up doing because they were at home during the pandemic. So there's still a lot of trends that we see during this pandemic period that will take years to figure out whether they're actual changes or just temporary shifts, pulling behavior forward, pushing it back.
Jed, I think it's interesting that you point out that even within these dense urban cities, there's this difference between neighborhoods. So for example, in more expensive neighborhoods where people might have a second home, maybe they moved out of the city to their second home, or even in San Francisco, we're seeing where single family housing is still trading and selling fast. So if you have a family, you need more space and you can afford to buy a house and stay in the city, maybe you will. And I think what you're saying around this plays out into what are these broader population shifts. I wonder how this pandemic will affect decisions that people with families make. And do they realize they need more space, a yard, the schooling? What does that mean for cities where it's difficult to find some of those things? And, even lived in Chicago for a long time. And about 10 years ago, Chicago really started losing population. And I was researching where is the population growing? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And one of the things that I found out was that specifically in Chicago, people were leaving the city, people with families were leaving the city, and people with families weren't moving to Chicago. When you looked at pure household growth, Chicago was in line with many of the other growing cities, but its population was declining because it had much smaller households. For example, it was growing at the same percentage of households as even Nashville, which was really growing at the time. So you could compare Chicago and Nashville. So they were both growing from 2009 to 2014. They both had the same number of household growths, about 17,000 each. But Nashville's population doubled because all of their growth was in family households, while all of Chicago's growth was in single or non-family households. So I think, those are some other factors at play. And like you're saying, I think we'll need to figure out what this means for the long term.
Yeah, Chrissy, I think that's right. The trends that you're talking about have been going on at least for 20 years. I agree that we can't just look at sort of overall growth. We really have to think about the composition of who lives where, what types of families, what types of people. But one of the big trends in lots of dense urban neighborhoods has been a decline in school-age kids and an increase in the share of both families without kids and families with kids up to age 5. And that's been a trend across lots of dense cities, again, long before the pandemic started. But those compositional changes often end up saying a lot more than just the overall totals. It also helps explain why people might perceive changes differently. There's a wave when everyone thought 2013, 2014, 2015 that everyone was moving to cities. Well, in fact, young people with college degrees were definitely moving to some expensive neighborhoods in dense cities. But that was basically only true for that demographic group. It's just that that was a demographic group that wrote for lots of major media outlets and were particularly vocal on social media. And so these compositional shifts end up sometimes introducing biases in terms of what urban trends are perceived and which ones are overlooked.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point about where people live and how that gets reported, because during the pandemic, the reports were about this mass exodus. But what you found was kind of that the exodus was actually just people, like you said, making those decisions maybe a year earlier than they would have otherwise and going to places like Austin, which they were already going to, or Boise or Sunbelt cities. How much does that concentration of the media in San Francisco and New York affect that discussion overall?
I think there are noisy places that get, way more than their share of sort of attention in contributing to how people understand what's happening in cities and elsewhere in the country. I think some of it is bias in terms of who lives there and whether, where reporters live. I think some of it also is there are cities that tend to get more places that tend to get more attention regardless. Florida, I think, gets even more attention than you might expect based on who lives there, partly because it's a retirement destination, or at least aspirationally a retirement destination for so much of the country. So more people have a stake in Florida than just those who live there. And I think there are also places that are extreme in lots of ways. I think San Francisco is an example of this, that some things about San Francisco tend to get more attention because they either confirm or deny people's existing biases of this strange place we live in, even though San Francisco is almost never representative of any kind of national trends.
Jed, you mentioned that these trends may have just been accelerated by the pandemic, or people put off, what people may have put off for a year or two, they just accelerated, or that for a while there, young singles were moving to dense urban areas, and that contributed to some of the narrative around city growth. And I wonder have you seen any data, any research around millennials, and is it in millennial growth patterns where maybe millennials have just delayed some of that suburban growth, or migrating to the suburbs because they're either starting families later or having children later, and the generations before them who might have migrated in their 20s, millennials are waiting longer, and that's sort of playing out now. Have you seen anything that might relate to millennials and migration and how it's affecting this data?
Yeah, there's no question that there have been dramatic changes over the past 50 years in terms of partnering and marriage and having kids, all these things that lead to household formation. Back in around 1970, roughly half of 18 to 34-year-olds were married with kids. 50 years later, it was about 20% of 18 to 34-year-olds who were married with kids. It basically meant something completely different in terms of life stage to be 26 now than it did 50 years ago. And when you think about some of these decisions, like buying a home, like moving to a neighborhood where you have more space, we often measure and report them based on age and what's happening with an age group. But they have as much to do with someone's life stage. And the connection between age and life stage is totally different than it used to be. Same on the retirement side, where people retire later than they used to. They stay in single-family homes and stay in suburbs much longer than they used to, if you look back 20, 30, or 50 years ago. And so some of these things that may look like behavioral changes are actually just changes that are more tied to life stage, and life stages map to different ages than they used to.
I'm wondering how much this discussion about life stages, is going to be impacted by the ideas of remote work. Now, I've said many times on the show that I'm not going to make any post-pandemic predictions because we have no idea what's going to happen in terms of remote work, in terms of transportation, like the rush hour change or anything like that, because until we actually get back into, not even back into, just get into a new situation, we're not really going to know. But I'm wondering how much that remote work piece impacts, kind of what might be possible going forward. In the Hiring Lab blog that you sent us, which is really fascinating, one of the things that stuck out to me was the benefit not to major cities, but the benefit to smaller cities that could attract the people that are living in the larger cities from work. But then the workers actually get that benefit of living in the larger cities. So they have a bigger job pool, but then the smaller cities actually have a larger job pool now as well. It's just a fascinating thing. And how does that tie into like people's life stages and where they're going and how much access they have to jobs in other places?
Yeah, I think remote work will be a very big deal for some people and not a big deal at all for lots and lots of other people. I mean, one thing that has been very clear is that fewer than half of people are in jobs that can be done remotely. Somewhere between 30 to 40% of us work in jobs, that can be done from home. That is very skewed toward people with college or graduate degrees. And so everything that we say about remote work, first of all, refers to a fortunate minority of the population. I think also the benefits and costs of remote work may turn out to be surprising in the sense that remote work has a lot of benefits for people who already have professional networks or worked in their organizations for a while. They know people, they know how to get stuff done. It also has an advantage for people who might not be looking for another job. And therefore, they can sort of move to someplace else entirely and not worry about whether their next job might want them in an office and therefore whether they need to be in a labor market that has lots of jobs. I think the choice is very different for younger people who don't already have the same professional networks. They might not have been in their organization as long. Cities are also where people find each other as partners or to hook up or to make new friends. All things that younger people typically, need cities more than older people do. And so even though people might imagine that young people are more comfortable with remote work because they're more comfortable with technology and all that, when you think about why people live in cities and why people want to be near other people or their employers, the advantages of remote work might make a lot more sense for older people. And I think that is another way in which the pandemic might accelerate some of the pre-existing trends. Cities were getting younger. Older people were staying longer in suburbs, longer in single-family homes. And if those are the folks for whom remote work is most appealing, we could see even more of that over time.
Yeah, I was just talking to my husband about the fact that, this conversation on remote work and how it may affect careers in general. Being in my 20s when I was just starting out, being in the office or the state capitol or city hall, that was so important for me to be face to face with people, learn from other people. And we're trying to do that over Zoom, but it's just not the same. And the amount of career growth you can get from those interactions and experiences just can't be replicated over Zoom.
Yeah, and I think the longer this period goes on, people are going to start seeing some of their colleagues or maybe some of their competitors go back to the office. And there's going to be some FOMO. If your colleagues are having FaceTime in front of the boss and you are not, you might start to feel a disadvantage working remotely in a way that no one did in a period when all of your own colleagues are working remotely. So it may be that in some ways, certainly remote work will get better and more productive over time, but there are other ways in which remote work might get less productive and less appealing over time as some people and some businesses go back into the office.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about having those connections when you're younger, because it does make a difference in terms of who you meet, who you know, who you get to know over time. If we can't get to that when we're younger, and maybe we're benefiting from that now actually for a little while. I think I heard somewhere where somebody said, where there's a lot of innovation that happened before the pandemic that's getting kind of exhausted during the pandemic. And at some point that runs out. And so you have to get back together with people and do the hard work of innovating and connecting. And it doesn't need to be done every day. Monday through Friday, it doesn't need to be done. But at the same time, you still probably have to have that connection in the office to move things forward.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're seeing. Google just announced that people will still have to be in the office 3 days a week. Or, what does remote work mean? It's probably some form of flexibility, maybe more flexibility, but there's probably going to still be some office component. So this whole migration pattern around, will we be able to live in another city and remote in? I mean, we'll see how that plays out. And I know, Jed, you've just done some data on Tech Hub, looking at data on tech hubs and whether or not they're offering remote work, and the cities that are offering remote work. So I think that's still to be seen whether or not, people can move within the Bay Area, but not leave the Bay Area.
Right. I think we'll see much less of people moving from the Bay Area or from New York to someplace far away on the mountaintop or on the island or whatever, and much more people moving from an in-town expensive neighborhood to a more affordable neighborhood with more space, with a commute that you wouldn't want to do every day, but at once or twice a week is totally manageable. And so that's much more about shifts within the metropolitan area, within the labor market. And we might even think of, what is the Bay Area as spreading out a bit. If the Bay Area includes not everything that's up to a 90-minute commute, but everything that's up to a 3-hour commute. But that's very different than everyone from San Francisco, packing up and going to, pick your small town in Idaho or Arkansas or in North Carolina.
Everyone's moving. If you look at home prices in Sacramento right now, people have definitely moved there. And I think that also, I wonder how, if it's a 2-hour commute, a lot of these smaller towns, especially in California, they have restricted housing growth too. I've tried to get housing through some of these planning commissions, and it's very difficult. So, I also wonder how will play out between people. We don't want these San Francisco residents moving to our name your small town. We're not going to build any affordable housing or more housing. So those places just continue to get more expensive.
I think that's right. And I think people have been very aware of housing supply constraints and regulations in big cities. But if there is a movement farther out to more affordable neighborhoods, if people are willing to book longer commutes, I think there'll be growing awareness of the kinds of regulations and supply constraints that exist in lots of suburbs and ex-urban areas. If you look at land use patterns in a lot of the West, the boundary is based on how far water hookups go. In some places, very non-urban places, there are housing supply constraints. And one effect of remote work is that people might start to become more aware of how broad a range of limits there are on building new housing, including very different limits than the kinds that we see in big cities.
Another interesting thing is that I had a discussion with one of my good friends last week, and they were talking about how a lot of companies are asking, if you're applying for a new job, they're asking that they're saying you can be remote for now, but then we're going to come back to the office. But then they're saying you can't move to Idaho or whatever from Texas or wherever it is. And one of the reasons that they gave is because their tax departments don't want to have to worry about 49 different other states' tax policies related to their company and healthcare and all that stuff. So even if you have remote workers, it seems like it's even difficult from the internal standpoint of trying to hook everybody up with their healthcare and their and pay their employment taxes. And if you're in California, obviously we have an income tax, and if you're in Texas, you don't, and those types of things. So that there's so many layers to this that get really interesting when you add them up.
That's right. Even if the technology exists for people to work remotely, there are all kinds of other costs. I mean, the sort of tax system differences you pointed out were across states. That's a much bigger deal across countries. And so there are people who may be able to work remotely anywhere they want within the US, but not outside. The other, of course, is time zones. Being remote in the same time zone is very different than being remote 5 time zones away. And so there are lots of things that technology makes possible that business processes, still don't make feasible.
Is there anything from the data or from what you've been looking at this last year that surprised you, that's like kind of stuck out to you, something you didn't expect to see in the data that you've been combing over?
One of the biggest consistent surprises for me has been the amount of job loss in places where people could work from home. In the Bay Area, New York, Seattle, DC, the employment in tech and finance and media looked pretty much like other places. But there was a much bigger loss of jobs and businesses in retail and restaurants and other kinds of local services because people were working at home and therefore not spending as much locally. If you go, downtown San Francisco, the closures look very different than if you walk around Valencia Street or other residential neighborhoods where people might be spending even more money during the day than they were spending before. And so one irony of the increase of remote work is it highlighted how locally interdependent lots of businesses are. Restaurants really suffered if they served office workers in districts full of industries where people could work from home. They suffered much less so elsewhere. Same with travel and hospitality. Places that are international destinations or convention centers suffered much more than vacation areas and resort towns that people drive to from around the region. There are lots of vacation resort areas across the US that actually did really well last year because instead of traveling on a plane across the country or overseas, people were instead going to go hiking in like the nearby regional park or forest. So even within sectors that generally were hurt in the pandemic, huge geographic differences based on who their customers are.
And I wondered how much that has to do with looking at even the jobs report that came out and the fact that there's this gap between the number of jobs available right now and people looking for work is because, like you're saying, a lot of the jobs that were lost are in the service or hospitality industry, especially in downtowns. And we know that there are people that have just left the labor force. So they're not getting unemployment. They're not looking for jobs. And a lot of those people are women who maybe were overrepresented in some of the service industry or retail. If those people don't come back to the labor force, what does that mean for those sectors and how and where they grow or what locations they can grow if they can't find workers to fill roles? And we're definitely hearing that from some industries that they just can't find workers to fill those roles right now because people have left the labor market.
Yeah, there's been concerns for a while about all the constraints that are holding workers back from re-entering the labor force, from taking jobs. And the jobs report that we got this past Friday, the April jobs report, fell far short of what was expected in terms of job growth. And economists are now spending all day long arguing whether this is employers not wanting to hire or job seekers not wanting to work. There are several reasons why there are labor supply constraints, reasons why people aren't working as much as you might expect. One absolutely remains caregiving burdens. With schools closed or not open all the time, daycare is still closed. There's been a huge burden on parents, especially mothers. And that's very clear in the unemployment data, where the employment rate for mothers has fallen much more during the pandemic than the employment rate for fathers or for women without kids. And that really hasn't started to improve that much. Hopefully by end of summer, when the school year starts, that will look very different, but it doesn't yet. The second big issue, of course, is people who are either sick or are concerned about getting or transmitting the virus at work. Hopefully, as vaccinations become more widespread, that fades as an issue and a concern. The third, which is more an open question, is whether the unemployment insurance extension from the federal government, that extra $300 a week until the beginning of September, is a disincentive for people to work. It is sort of hard to tease that out from the caregiving burden and the concern about the virus. It is also a very different context right now this year than it was last year. Last year, it was pretty clear that those unemployment insurance benefits were not causing a problem in terms of creating a disincentive to work. But the labor market's tighter now. Employers are looking to hire more now, and people have more things they can do now. They can take advantage of visiting family that they haven't done for 15 months. And so, the decision to work and the expectation of whether there might be a job a few months from now if you don't go back today actually looks very different than it did a year ago. So we might be in for a period of employers having more difficulty than they expected hiring workers, though a lot of that should be temporary and should ease at some point over the summer.
Yeah, that discussion is fraught with politics too. I mean, there's you see the fights on Twitter breaking out all over the place about people putting signs on their windows saying people decided to come to work today or not come to work today, and all hell breaks loose when you start posting things on Twitter. Obviously, that's what it's for. But it's kind of crazy how that all works out. Another interesting thing about some of the work that you've done, Jed, is we're looking at these county reductions in population. Part of it's the impact of immigrants, and not it's not going to be about births necessarily or deaths for that matter. It's going to be about immigration, and I'm wondering why the big counties are different from maybe some of the in terms of population, in terms different from the smaller ones.
It's long been the case that the sources of population growth look very different in urban counties, suburban counties, and rural counties across the U.S. San Francisco is a good example. There are lots of other very urban counties that follow the same pattern of places that tend to lose a lot of people because of domestic migration, moving from one city in the U.S. to another, while at the same time they gain more than other places do from international migration. It's happened certainly during the pandemic, but really since the start of the Trump administration, was a big drop in immigration to the U.S. And that has meant by itself slower population growth in some of the biggest cities. The largest metros in the U.S., New York, LA, Chicago, have all lost population in the last couple of years, even before the pandemic. Again, some of this is about domestic migration, but it's more that the main source of population growth in these bigger cities, which has been immigration, has slowed down considerably. It may turn around. That's a question for what happens not only with the virus but also policy. But for all the talk about people leaving San Francisco and going to Miami or Austin or Boise or elsewhere, all of this focus on domestic migration during the pandemic, it's the slowdown in immigration that's had as big an effect on what's happened to population in big cities.
What's also, I think, interesting is how this drives kind of a national political discussion. And now we're talking about reapportionment in terms of, how many congressional seats are given to each state based on the total population. And then there's all these factors that impact who is moving in and moving out of cities. So you have this migration, which has been kind of gummed up a little bit over the last 4 years. You have the potentially remote work. You have a lack of housing production from all this too, and more data points that are weighing in on this this result that we got from the 2020 census. Do you think that 2020 represents a kind of a national shift from a purely location-based standpoint, from that lack of housing production, lack of migration, lack of maybe births in cities, and that changes the calculus for a lot of states?
I think it's certainly too soon to say. Looking at not just migration patterns, but also voting patterns by place, there have been most of the trends that we had seen recently are actually trends that have been going on for several election cycles. So trends like the increasing polarization by education, where places where more people have college degrees vote more Democratic. That's a trend that's been going on for many cycles. Some of the shifts by density, urban places increasingly denser suburbs, moving left. That's also a trend that's been going on. And what's perhaps most striking is how consistent voting patterns are geographically over time. And when you look at a scatter plot of how every county voted in 2020 versus 2016, like you would never know how contentious and disruptive that election was. The patterns looked almost the same with some very minor shifts in a handful of places. But so much of what we see is surprisingly stable over time. It means that relatively small changes in population or in demographics or in redistricting can end up having a very big impact on what happens, especially in a country where Congress is divided almost 50-50. A world where very, very small shifts, one demographic group moves a few points to the right or left, can probably have no difference, depending which group and where that is, but could possibly make all the difference if it's place that determines a national outcome.
I think that is a really good point. Going back to that Chicago data, I looked at migration of where people were moving, and there was a direct line from Chicago to Atlanta. So this is beginning 10 years ago. And I was wondering, like, combined with all the efforts around the Get Out to Vote with Stacey Abrams in Georgia, are people migrating from cities to either from the urban, San Francisco, Chicago, New York to the Sun Belt or Texas? They can make these shifts, and you see that coming out of the election results. And, maybe that's what some of the results we saw in Georgia that played out.
Yeah, and Georgia is a very good example of a place that really has changed in terms of its voting patterns. The suburbs around Atlanta, some of the inner suburbs have really moved left. The counterexample is Long Island in New York State, which relative to 20 years ago has moved to the right. There are these examples of places where they really vote differently than they did once we look far enough back in time. But election to election, I'm always struck by how similar the patterns are, even if the overall outcome of the election may feel like a 180.
Awesome. I don't have much to add to that before we move to the next section. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it. So thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had many people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month will get you some stickers, and $10 a month will get you our bus-only scarf. Listener questions and comments. So this is from an episode we had a couple weeks ago with the folks from Portland talking about the freeway fight up there. So Jonathan McMillan writes, I was listening to your podcast today, Portland Freeway Fight, and had a thought about the term freeway. Or do you think this term free taps into the American psychology and their entitled attitude towards freeway expansion? Do you think it contributes to the resistance to congestion pricing? I tried Googling this, but came up empty. Chrissy, do you have any thoughts on free freeways versus toll freeways?
I hate the term freeway. It's not free. It's not, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know when we started using the term freeway, but I would try to find out.
So I did a little bit of research. And so the term freeway actually came out of the construction of the Arroyo Seco Parkway in Los Angeles, which was completed in 1963. So instead of toll roads at the time, it was completely free of tolls, and so they called it a freeway. And so I guess it was that's where the free came from. And I think for all intents and purposes, that free, at least on the West Coast, it's kind of burrowed into our subconscious, in that we don't really notice the word anymore unless we're transit nerds or transportation nerds. Because I think most people just kind of say the word and don't even think much about why it's freeway and not highway or expressway. So I think that's probably part of it. And then another one is just this kind of general tax aversion. It feels like, where people are like, hey, I already paid for that road through my taxes, which can be true or not true based on where you're located. But I think that's part of the subconscious kind of mental math that people do when they think about a freeway.
And we never call a highway that's built using a public-private partnership a freeway. I've never once seen It's called a express. Yeah. So
Yeah.
just throw that out.
So hopefully, Jonathan, that answers your question a little bit. If you have a comment or question, feel free to tweet at us or comment at any of the social sites where the podcast appears, or feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. So finally, Puppies and Butterflies is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. Chrissy, do you have a Puppies and Butterflies?
Are you going to talk about Saturday Night Live?
I did not watch Saturday. I refused to watch it. I refused to watch Elon Musk on Saturday Night Live.
Well, I did.
You watched it. What did you think?
Yeah, I'm probably, I don't even need to have commentary on the show. Maybe Jed has some commentary if you watched. I was thinking, well, I mean, it's just a marketing ploy, which now we're giving it more marketing, but people forget that Elon Musk got a $500 million federal loan when Tesla was about to, he said that Tesla could not move forward without some investment, and they got a loan during the 2008 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So, just gonna throw that out there.
It is frustrating, and I hate giving him more airtime, but it's a topic that a lot of people think about and hear about and all those things. So, he as people listeners know, he frustrates me to no end because of how he talks about transportation and his windshield perspective and all those things. So I'm guessing Jed is also going to stay out of this conversation as well, which is fine.
Yes, I think my contribution, having nothing to do with anything we've talked about yet, is that I've just been, amazed at like the creative cooking that people are writing about from this pandemic. And, some of the blogs, I just came across a new one last night that, I can't believe I, didn't find 14 months ago and so many, home cooked meals ago. It's by Mandy Lee, and it's this extraordinary set of recipes and insights and opinion about food, including recipes and combinations that, I would never, ever come up with. And then as soon as I just sort of see the list of ingredients, it seems brilliant. And so I'm excited to cook my way through her blog and cookbook.
That's awesome. We've been doing tons of cooking over the pandemic, and definitely we've looked everywhere, high and low. When we think of something to eat that we want to eat or think we want to eat, it kind of goes into our rotation maybe. And so we've done like butter chicken, and we've done ribs and all this other stuff. And then sometimes we do stuff and we decide, well, that's way too hard, and we can't wait for restaurants to come back so we can just purchase this thing that would have taken us 5 hours to make otherwise. I think My Puppies and Butterflies there's a show on HGTV that's been just, I don't know how frequent it is, but it's a bargain block. And basically these two guys in Detroit, they basically go from house to house. They buy a number of different houses in a single like kind of neighborhood. And then they build, they renovate one. They buy them from the land bank for $1,000 or so. And then they renovate it to the point where they can live in a room. And then they keep renovating it. And then they buy another house to start renovating. And then they move to that house. And one of the best parts of the show, I think, is when they start moving to that other house. They have a truck, but they put all of their stuff in like a shopping cart and a wagon, and they just kind of drag it. So you see this wagon with like a palm tree and a little like lamp and things that they're dragging behind them going to the next house. And there's something so endearing about like, generally HGTV has all these stars and they have like contractors doing all the work for them, but these guys are actually living in these houses and building them and renovating them. And the guy, one of the guys I think his name is Keith. He's a big artist. And so every single house has its own kind of stamp on it. And it's just really fun. I don't know if you all have seen this show or not, but if you haven't, definitely check it out if you get a chance. Have you seen it, Chrissy?
I haven't seen it. I do watch HGTV a lot, so
yeah,
I'll check it out.
I have not seen it, but we'll put it on the list.
Definitely worth your while. I think it's for fun, anyways. Just the art inside the houses is quite in fun, for lack of a better term. All right, well, Jed, where can folks find you online?
I am at hiringlab.org and at jedkolko.com, and I'm often on Twitter, Jed Kolko.
Awesome. Chrissy?
I'm at mycuriouscity.com and at Mancini Chrissy on Twitter.
Awesome. And you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at TheOverheadWire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. And thanks to our generous Patreon for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thanks to Jed and Chrissy for coming on this week's show. And we'll see you next time.
Talking Monday.